Today, we enter the 1960s, when entheogens moved from older ceremonial lineages further into modern counterculture, religion, psychiatry, and academic debate. We will trace the evidence chronologically, while keeping sight of the spiritual systems that preserved these sacraments and gave them meaning, long before the decade made them famous. Across the 1960s, entheogenic evidence appears in laboratories, churches, libraries, reservation grounds, and underground gatherings, revealing not one story but many overlapping ones. The decade sits at a crossroads where peyote, psilocybin mushrooms, ayahuasca, cannabis, LSD, and related sacraments were discussed as tools of healing, revelation, prophecy, ecstasy, and transformation. In traditional frameworks, these substances were not framed as mere drugs, but as sacred tools used in ritual, prayer, chanting, drumming, fasting, dance, and initiatory discipline. At the same time, the 1960s helped create a modern vocabulary of mystical experience, ego dissolution, altered awareness, and psychedelic states that would later shape scientific research and public discourse. Scholars and seekers were increasingly comparing these experiences to themes found in older mystery religions: shamanic ascent, Dionysian ecstasy, Eleusinian kykeon, Vedic soma, Zoroastrian hauma, and other esoteric and entheogenic systems of sacred knowledge. This comparison mattered because it linked modern chemical experiences to ancient claims about direct contact with divinity, hidden wisdom, and initiatory rebirth. The result was a decade in which science, mysticism, anthropology, and rebellion against authority began to overlap in ways that changed the public philosophical imagination. The story of the 1960s is therefore not just about drugs entering popular culture, but about old ritual technologies being reinterpreted inside modern institutional frameworks. Before we begin, I want to take a moment and thank our monthly members. You help to fuel the enlightening education that benefits many around the world. Your support enables S.E.E.K to continue creating content, providing a path for all spiritual seekers. Support us with a monthly membership on YouTube, Patreon, or Ko-Fi at Join S.E.E.K, or on Facebook at Join S.E.E.K1. Become a member and you will see your name in future videos. Thank you. We begin in 1960, when the modern entheogenic era entered the academic mainstream through Harvard, psilocybin, and the early work of Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert. At the same time, older streams of sacred plant use, especially cacti, fungi, and other visionary plants of indigenous shamanism, were being re-evaluated through the language of psychology, religion, and consciousness studies. The story of the 1960s begins with continuity as much as novelty, because entheogens had long belonged to spiritual systems in Mesoamerica, North America, and other ritual worlds before the decade made them famous again. In 1960, Timothy Leary's first encounters with psilocybin helped transform a Harvard research program into one of the most discussed psychedelic experiments of the era, and Richard Alpert became part of that intellectual and practical unfolding. What makes this moment historically important is that it linked sacred experience to the laboratory without fully separating the two. So the language of revelation, conversion, and altered awareness began to sit beside clinical observation. That same year, the broader intellectual climate was already prepared for a change, because figures such as Aldous Huxley and Humphry Osmond had spent the previous decade discussing mescaline, vision, and the possible spiritual use of psychedelics. Huxley's The Doors of Perception, though published the decade prior, still cast a long shadow over the early 1960s because it gave educated readers a vocabulary for mystical perception shaped by mescaline experience and philosophical reflection. Huxley's thinking connected psychedelics to older mystical and esoteric spiritual systems, where altered awareness was already treated as a doorway into hidden reality rather than a mere side effect. Osmond, who coined the word psychedelic, helped move hallucinogenic substances out of purely medical categories and toward a more expansive frame, in which mind-manifesting experience could be studied as spiritually significant. Osmond's psychiatric background gave the psychedelic discussion a medical and experimental legitimacy that later researchers would inherit. This matters because the 1960s did not invent psychedelic meaning. They made it legible to modern institutions that had often ignored or misunderstood older spiritual systems. The decade therefore opens with the convergence of Harvard research, literary reflection, psychiatric experimentation, and indigenous sacramental continuity. From the beginning, the question was not only what these substances do, but how do humans interpret what they do? That first year sets the pattern for the whole decade because it shows psychedelics entering modern life through both scholarship and sacred language. By 1961, the conversation had widened beyond Harvard and into the broader international discussion shaped by Huxley, Osmond, and the growing psychedelic vocabulary. In 1961, Aldous Huxley and Humphry Osmond's correspondence continued to refine the intellectual and spiritual meaning of psychedelic experience, especially around mescaline, vision, and the possibility of disciplined inner transformation. This is an important figure point in the decade because it shows that the 1960s psychedelic conversation was not only American and not only countercultural. It was also literary, philosophical, and deeply transnational. Meanwhile, Leary and Alpert were turning Harvard into a site where psilocybin could be explored as a tool for understanding consciousness, personality, and spiritual response. In the background, older sacramental forms remained visible. Peyote ceremonies among native communities continued to show that an entheogen could belong inside a living religious order with prayer, song, and communal discipline. That continuity matters because it prevents the 1960s from being mistaken for the origin of sacred psychedelic use. The decade instead reveals a reappearance of old patterns inside a new media and academic environment. It also shows how rapidly a term like psychedelic could become a bridge between psychiatry, literature, and esoteric inquiry. By the end of 1961, the field was set for a more formal test of whether psychedelics could reliably induce mystical experience under controlled conditions. The crucial turn comes in 1962, when the question moves from discussion to action. The Good Friday experiment would become one of the decade's clearest pieces of evidence that psilocybin could reliably occasion experiences that participants interpreted as profoundly spiritual. The Harvard Psilocybin Project shifted entheogenic history by popularizing psychedelic research, catalyzing the 1960s counterculture, and later prompting federal drug criminalization. Led by Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert from 1960 to 1963, the controversial university experiments brought mind-altering substances out of clinical obscurity and into mainstream public awareness. Leary and Alpert's subsequent dismissal from Harvard transformed them into prominent counterculture icons who fueled the wider spiritual and social revolution of the era. The Concord Prison Experiment from 1961 to 1963 marks a key turning point in entheogenic history, highlighting both the early academic promise and the ultimate downfall of early psychedelic research. Led by Timothy Leary at Harvard University, the study used psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy on inmates to lower recidivism and re-incarceration rates. However, controversies over methodology, boundary-crossing researcher behavior, and Leary's eventual ouster from Harvard catalyzed the later total prohibition of entheogens. Walter Pahnke's Good Friday experiment, conducted in 1962 at Boston University's Marsh Chapel, brought the study of psychedelics and religion into direct contact. Pahnke administered psilocybin to divinity students in a carefully structured setting, intended to test whether the drug could occasion mystical consciousness. That design is crucial because it took seriously the idea that sacred experience depends on context, preparation, and ritual environment, not just on chemistry. The study's importance lies in its mixture of scientific caution and spiritual ambition. It tried to measure what had long been described in mystical spiritual systems as direct contact with the sacred. The experiment also drew attention to the emerging concept of mystical type experience, which would become central to later psychedelic research and religious interpretation. In the historical arc of entheogens, this moment is especially significant because it linked modern psychology to older models of initiation, revelation, and rebirth. It showed that a substance associated with laboratory research could also be studied as a sacramental catalyst, and demonstrated that psilocybin could reliably occasion experiences indistinguishable from classical mystical states within a religious setting. That insight resonated with the continuing visibility of peyote and other traditional entheogens, which had already demonstrated that ritual form shapes meaning. It also echoed Huxley and Osmond's earlier discussions, where vision, discipline, and consciousness were already being framed in spiritual terms. In 1962, Ken Kesey released One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, shaped by his participation in early LSD research, embedding psychedelic critique of authority and consciousness into mainstream American literature. After his literary success, Kesey moved to Perry Lane and later bought a remote mountain property in La Honda, California. This ranch became an open-door bohemian salon. Alongside figures like Neil Cassidy and Ken Babbs, Kesey formed the Merry Pranksters, turning communal living, spontaneous theatrical disruption, and heavy psychedelic use into a unified lifestyle. The psychedelic counterculture represented a philosophical and metaphysical revolution, reformulating consciousness as both inner cosmos and social frontier, while drawing deeply from Eastern philosophies like Vedanta, Zen Buddhism, and yoga to interpret the ineffable states induced by LSD, mescaline, and psilocybin. Figures like Alan Watts in his work The Joyous Cosmology, published 1962, and D.T. Suzuki supplied a lexicon of non-dual insight that made LSD experiences intelligible as awakenings, not psychoses. Concurrently, Western occult currents like Thelema, Hermeticism, and Jungian alchemy revived among groups pursuing initiatory spirituality outside institutional religion. Communes and intentional psychedelic communities like Esalen Institute in California became laboratories of modern mysticism, integrating entheogenic ritual, ecstatic dance, and esoteric psychology into cohesive programs of inner transformation. Founded in 1962 by Michael Murphy and Dick Price in Big Sur, California, Esalen focused on alternative education, humanistic psychology, and the exploration of human potential. The Institute hosted early discussions and figures exploring drug-induced mysticism and consciousness expansion, though it functioned primarily as an educational retreat center rather than a residential drug commune. By 1962 then, the decade had already produced a foundational pattern. Old sacred spiritual systems were being reinterpreted through modern academic and clinical methods. That pattern would deepen as the decade continued, and it would eventually spread far beyond the walls of Harvard and Boston University. The rest of the decade will expand that frame through books, figures, experiments, public debate, and the growing tension between sacrament and spectacle. The years from 1960 to 1962 had transformed entheogens from the subject of isolated research into a growing cultural and intellectual movement that would reshape science, religion, philosophy, psychology, and the public imagination. As we turn now to 1963 and 1964, that momentum would accelerate into one of the most consequential periods in the history of consciousness exploration. By 1963 and 1964, the entheogenic conversation had moved from experiment into interpretation. The decade now produced books, essays, and public arguments that tried to explain whether psychedelics belong to psychiatry, religion, mysticism, or all three at once. Timothy Leary was fired from Harvard University in May of 1963, specifically announced around May 27th, alongside his colleague Richard Alpert. The reason for this were, first, unorthodox experiments and giving psilocybin and LSD to students and subjects. Second, neglecting duties and failing to show up for classes and abandoning teaching responsibilities. And finally, third, public controversy and generating intense media alarm over recreational drug promotion. The Millbrook Entheogenic community was founded in September of 1963 when Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, and Ralph Metzner established their psychedelic research and communal center at the Hitchcock Estate in Millbrook, New York. The 2,500-acre William Mellon Hitchcock Estate in Millbrook was provided by financial heir Billy Hitchcock. This estate transitioned their work from the Harvard Psilocybin Project to a private communal base for consciousness expansion and psychedelic research. The early 1960s, after the Good Friday experiment, were no longer just about whether psilocybin could trigger extraordinary states. They were about what those states meant. Huston Smith became one of the most important voices in that debate when he asked in 1964, "Do drugs have religious import?" That question matters because it moved the subject from laboratory method into the philosophy of religion, insisting that scholars take psychedelic reports seriously rather than dismiss them as trivial side effects. Huston Smith's essay made the philosophical case that the religious import of drugs could not be ignored if one was serious about mystical phenomenology. Smith's argument was historically significant because he treated the reports from psychedelic users as worthy of comparison with classical mystics, rather than as mere cultural noise. Smith argued that the key issue was not simply whether drugs produce unusual states, but whether those states can be described in terms that overlap with the greatest mystical spiritual systems. That position gave the 1960s a major interpretive bridge between modern psychedelics and older esoteric systems, including the Great Chain of Being, contemplative religion, and initiatory metaphysics. In parallel, Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, and Richard Alpert were building a more practical and ritualized framework in the Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, published in 1964. This 1964 work is especially important because it made the Tibetan Bardo Thadal into a map for modern psychedelic practice. Leary, Metzner, and Alpert were saying, in effect, that the psychedelic journey could be understood as an encounter with death, transition, and liberation, ideas long central to esoteric Buddhism. That comparison helped normalize the idea that entheogenic states could be studied as part of the long history of sacred consciousness. It also reinforced the importance of the set and setting model, because the same substance could become spiritually meaningful or psychologically chaotic, depending on preparation and context. The book also brought together the work of Huxley, Osmond, and Harvard-era experimentation, since it stood at the intersection of literary modernism, psychiatric research, and spiritual instruction. In traditional religious settings, that insight is not new. Ritual specialists have long known that the cosmological frame shapes the revelation. That text is one of the decade's most important books because it explicitly linked LSD practice to Tibetan Buddhist death and rebirth imagery, turning psychedelic use into a guided spiritual journey. It did not treat the experience as random intoxication. It treated it as a structured passage through ego dissolution, symbolic death, and possible rebirth. This is a major historical marker because it shows that the 1960s entheogenic field moved from exploration to codification. Texts like Smith's essay and Leary's manual show that the decade was producing not only experiences, but theories of how those experiences fit into religion and consciousness. By mid-decade, entheogens had become a topic that could be addressed in philosophy journals, religious studies, clinical settings, and counterculture circles all at once. In 1964, Ken Kesey's Merry Pranksters boarded a brightly painted 1939 International Harvester school bus named Further, traveling across the United States to document an emergent psychedelic reality, later immortalized in Tom Wolfe's book, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. Kesey and the pranksters organized public events known as acid tests in California and the Pacific Northwest, combining strobe lights, day-glow paint, improvisational art, and early performances by the Grateful Dead, then called the Warlocks. Designed to break down social conditioning and dissolve conventional boundaries, the acid tests effectively transition the underground beat generation into the mass hippie counterculture. The 1960s were therefore not only a decade of chemical discovery, but of spiritual translation. Psychedelic experience was being translated into Buddhist metaphors, philosophical arguments, and clinical language, while older ceremonial spiritual systems continued to demonstrate that sacred use required discipline and lineage. This is the moment when entheogens began to look less like a novelty and more like a recurring feature of human spiritual history. The middle phase of the decade is crucial because it gave the 1960s a vocabulary for understanding sacred experience. It also shows how quickly psychedelic research began borrowing from Tibetan, Christian, and comparative religious frameworks, while also shaping the counterculture and literary scenes. By the time 1964 was underway, the field had expanded beyond Harvard and into a wider public argument about religion and consciousness. The rest of the decade will deepen that debate through new books, figures, and cultural movements. By 1965 and 1966, the entheogenic story had moved from private research and philosophical debate into organized culture, public performance, and increasingly visible religious experimentation. The mid-decade saw Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, Ralph Metzner, and related figures turn psychedelic consciousness into a framework that could be discussed, staged, and even institutionalized. In 1965, the Harvard-era research culture had already matured into a wider network of workshops, publications, and consciousness expansion events. Leary's circle at Millbrook was no longer just experimenting in a laboratory sense. It was building a social and spiritual ecology around LSD, psilocybin, meditation, yoga, and group transformation. The Castalia Foundation emerged as a key node in this period, named after the intellectual colony in Hermann Hesse's The Glass Bead Game, which itself is an important esoteric reference because it imagines a disciplined symbolic community of knowledge seekers. That literary choice tells us that the 1960s psychedelic movement was not only about drugs, it was also about creating new mythic and philosophical containers for altered awareness. At Millbrook, the language of consciousness expansion increasingly overlapped with ritual language, and the experience was framed as something more than recreation or clinical therapy. The group's activities included weekend retreats, experiential workshops, and mixed media events that attempted to reproduce or guide psychedelic states through non-drug means as well. That broadening is historically important because it shows the decade moving from pharmacology into spiritual practice and aesthetic performance. It also helps explain why the 1960s became such fertile ground for comparisons with older esoteric systems. The movement itself was beginning to behave like a mystery school, a retreat center, and a religious fellowship all at once. The evidence from this phase includes not just people and substances, but also flyers, charters, workshops, and public talks that demonstrate how a psychedelic subculture can become organized. By 1965, the entheogenic conversation was no longer confined to elite research. It was beginning to form communities and enter into public literature. Frank Herbert's book Dune, published in 1965, portrayed the so-called spice melange as a sacrament-granting expanded perception and prophetic vision, which was influenced in part by the author's experiences with psilocybin mushrooms. Simultaneously, Philip K. Dick published the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, a science fiction novel exploring artificial worlds and mind-altering substances like Can-D and Chu-Z, standing out as a major work dealing with altered awareness. Concurrently, in 1965, Dr. Sidney Cohen published The Drugs of Hallucination, a comprehensive early medical and psychological overview of psychedelic substances, exploring the scientific understanding of hallucinogens during the mid-1960s research peak. The middle part of the decade matters because it shows the emergence of institutional psychedelic spirituality. It also shows the start of a more public struggle over whether these experiences belong in religion, law, or solely in counterculture. In the same period, Leary's personal and legal troubles became part of the historical record, especially after his December 1965 arrest for marijuana possession. That arrest matters because it marks the transition from academic controversy to public confrontation with the state. It also helped push psychedelic discourse further into the language of religious freedom and sacramental use. Timothy Leary's post-Harvard trajectory evolved from the experimental communal estate in Millbrook into the Castalia Foundation, cross-pollinated with Arthur Klepp's Neo-American Church. Founded in 1965 by Millbrook participant Arthur Kleps, the original Kleptonian Neo-American Church treated psychedelic drugs, known as the true host, as holy sacraments. Kleps and Leary shared the strategy of using religious freedom protections to claim exemptions from criminal drug laws. Kleps' group maintained an absurdist, satirical tone with the motto "Victory over horseshit," and Leary was eventually excommunicated. A reason for Leary's institutional transformation at Millbrook was increasing intensive local police and political scrutiny, notably led by D.A.G. Gordon Liddy, which targeted the estate and prompted a shift toward legal and religious frameworks. The Castalia Foundation was formed as an operational shift at Millbrook, hosting non-drug and drug-assisted workshops, utilizing Gurdjieff mystic teachings and multimedia sensory projects to simulate psychedelic states. By 1966, Leary reorganized the Millbrook Castalia structure into the League for Spiritual Discovery, explicitly declaring LSD as a holy sacrament and attempting to build a religion around it. This is one of the decade's most revealing events because it shows entheogenic evidence becoming institutional evidence. People were now founding organizations, issuing charters, and framing psychedelic practice as a form of worship. The League for Spiritual Discovery explicitly drew inspiration from the Native American Church and its peyote traditions, indicating that the model of sacramental entheogen use was being borrowed from older indigenous religious practice. That borrowing is historically significant because it reveals both continuity and tension. The movement sought legitimacy through comparison to living spiritual systems, even as it reinvented those traditions in a modern idiom. Around the same time, Leary's book, Psychedelic Prayers After the Tao Te Ching, and related materials show that the movement was weaving together Taoism, Buddhist ideas, and psychedelic ritual into a composite spiritual language. The result was a highly eclectic esotericism in which Eastern texts, Western mysticism, and drug experience all informed one another. Formed in Laguna Beach in 1966, the Brotherhood of Eternal Love started as idealistic surfers seeking higher consciousness through entheogens, documented in Nicholas Shue's book, Orange Sunshine. They legally incorporated as a church to frame their use and distribution of LSD as a religious sacrament. They opened a popular Laguna Beach head shop called Mystic Arts World as a cultural hub for the movement. Partnering with master underground chemists, the group manufactured and distributed millions of doses of a potent bright orange LSD tablet known as Orange Sunshine. To maintain their supply and fund free distribution, they built a massive international smuggling network, moving tons of hashish from Afghanistan and marijuana into the United States. They maintained close ties with counterculture icon Dr. Timothy Leary, even helping orchestrate his prison escape the following decade. Simultaneously, operating secret laboratories in the San Francisco Bay Area during the mid-1960s, Owsley Stanley and his associates produced millions of doses of high-purity LSD. His product fueled iconic counterculture milestones, including the 1966 Trips Festival. Using proceeds from his chemistry, Stanley financed the early days of the Grateful Dead, serving as their sound engineer and tying psychedelic exploration directly to live rock music. Also in 1966, R.E.L. Masters and Gene Houston published the Varieties of Psychedelic Experience, the first comprehensive guide to the effects of LSD on human personality, detailing 15 years of research examining the therapeutic and psychological bounds of psychedelic drugs, just as federal interdiction began. That same year, John W. Aiken published Explorations in Awareness, a seminal work that probes the depths of consciousness and self-realization via psychedelic meditation, blending Christian, Vedic, and indigenous motifs as issued by the early pioneer Church of the Awakening. By the mid-1960s, the evidence shows psychedelic culture becoming both more public and more self-conscious about its religious claims. This is a major transition in the decade because it sets up the later explosion of public events, media attention, and social backlash. As the year 1966 unfolded, the psychedelic field becomes much more visible in public life. The story now moves from closed workshops and Harvard seminars into books, public lectures, press releases, and ceremonial performance. By the end of 1966, entheogens had become a focal point of scientific debate, spiritual experimentation, and increasing political concern across much of the Western world. With the arrival of 1967, these developments converged into a defining cultural moment that would leave a lasting impact on the history of consciousness and religion. By 1967, the entheogenic story had become a public spectacle as well as a spiritual movement. The year brought the human be-in, the summer of love, and the full flowering of psychedelic culture into mainstream visibility. In January of 1967, the Human Be-In in Golden Gate Park had announced a new phase of the decade, gathering tens of thousands around music, poetry, anti-war feeling, and psychedelic consciousness. Held in Golden Gate Park, this massive gathering of over 20,000 people merged political activism with psychedelic consciousness, featuring figures like Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg. Timothy Leary's famous "Turn on, tune in, drop out" became one of the era's defining statements, linking psychedelics to personal awakening and social nonconformity. This is important because it shows the movement moving beyond research circles and into mass cultural idioms. In San Francisco, the Summer of Love drew somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 young people into Haight-Ashbury and the surrounding Bay Area, where LSD, free clinics, free stores, psychedelic rock, and alternative spirituality all became intertwined. Fueled by music festivals like Monterey Pop and widespread public interest, the West Coast became the epicenter of the psychedelic counterculture. Documentaries of the era showed how this time period was a meeting of minds between 1950s Beat Generation beatniks and the hippies. That year also produced iconic cultural texts and songs that helped shape the public imagination of psychedelia, including Scott McKenzie's San Francisco and Jefferson Airplane's White Rabbit. The book LSD: The Problem-Solving Psychedelic by P.G. Stafford and B.H. Golightly was published in 1967, presenting a practical look at how psychedelics were theorized to enhance creative thought and problem-solving. Another book, The Private Sea: LSD and the Search for God by William Braden, was also released in 1967, a journalistic and philosophical exploration that analyzed the spiritual dimensions and theological implications of the burgeoning psychedelic movement. Finally, LSD: Man and Society, edited by Richard C. Diebold and Russell C. Leaf, featured contributions from figures like Frank Barron. This academic compilation captured contemporary scientific and sociological discourse surrounding hallucinogenic drugs during a pivotal transitional year. Throughout the 1960s, musicians such as Jerry Garcia, Jimi Hendrix, Carlos Santana, The Beatles, Pink Floyd, Jefferson Airplane, and the Grateful Dead translated LSD consciousness into improvisational music, extended performance, and symbolic lyricism, normalizing entheogenic states across youth culture. These are not just pop artifacts, they are evidence that entheogenic ideas had become embedded in the wider symbolic life of the decade. Music festivals and public gatherings, including Monterey Pop, further amplified that association by presenting psychedelic experience as part of a broader youth culture of art, freedom, and experimentation. Synthesized by Alexander Shulgin, the potent psychedelic DOM, widely known as STP, gained notoriety and intense underground media coverage in Berkeley during April and May of 1967. At the same time, this visibility had consequences, because the movement's expansion invited scrutiny, criticism, and eventual restriction. The 1967 moment is therefore both triumphant and fragile, a peak and a warning. It marks the point at which entheogenic ideas became impossible for the wider society to ignore. What makes 1967 so important is that it reveals the tension between spiritual aspiration and social overload. The same movement that championed expanded awareness also created the conditions for backlash, scandal, and eventually legal crackdown, while scholars and authors paved the way for the modern psychedelic renaissance. The late decade's next turn came in 1968, when social fear and political pressure hardened into legal restriction. We will discuss the comprehensive culmination of all entheogenic legal restrictions from the 1960s momentarily. At the same time, scholars and literary psychonauts were translating visionary states into public discourse. 1968 saw the publishing of American banker and amateur ethnomycologist R. Gordon Wasson's landmark book, Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality, hypothesizing the identity of the Hindu Soma as the fly-agaric Amanita muscaria mushroom. This hypothesis revolutionized entheogenic history by suggesting that early religious ecstasies and the roots of Indo-Iranian ritual stemmed from psychoactive fungi. 1968 also saw the publication of The Teachings of Don Juan by author Carlos Castaneda, a seminal book on his apprenticeship with a Yaqui shaman stemming from his alleged experiences with Don Juan Matus between 1960 and 1965. It was submitted as his master's thesis in anthropology and details Castaneda's journey into shamanism and altered states, becoming a major cultural phenomenon. In cinema, 1968 also saw the production of psychedelic films like Joe Musat's Wonderwall and the Beatles' Yellow Submarine, which translated entheogenic knowledge into cultural sensation. Star Trek episodes between 1966 and 1969 further explored consciousness expansion themes within a television setting. In This Side of Paradise, Season 1, Episode 24, the crew of the USS Enterprise visits Omicron Ceti 3 and finds colonists living in total harmony after being exposed to symbiotic alien plant spores. The spores induce a peaceful utopian state where work and ambition are abandoned for pure sensory and emotional contentment. This is considered a special and unique episode of Star Trek. It serves as an allegory for the hippie movement and drug culture. Captain Kirk eventually breaks the trance, not with logic, but by provoking intense human frustration and anger. In The Way to Eden, Season 3, Episode 20, often remembered as the Space Hippies episode, the story features a group of idealists who reject mainstream Federation values to search for a mythical, untainted paradise called Eden. Led by a brilliant but unstable doctor, they use sonic frequencies and a communal philosophy of nature and music to briefly sway members of the Enterprise crew. The journey critiques both the 1960s dropout culture and the uncritical romanticizing of uncultivated existence when their promised sanctuary turns out to be lethal. By this point, psychedelic culture had become associated in many minds with disorder and chaos, and that association helped justify criminalization and the end of federal support for research. This is a critical point in the chronology because it shows that the 1960s did not simply end in 1969. The turning process was already underway in 1968. Still, the historical record should not be reduced to prohibition alone, because the same years also produced deeper reflection on mystical experience and religious meaning. The work of Walter Pahnke, Huston Smith, Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, and Richard Alpert continued to influence how scholars thought about altered states, even when the public atmosphere grew hostile. Native traditions like the Native American Church remained a living proof that entheogenic sacraments could function inside a disciplined religious order, rather than a transient youth scene. That contrast becomes even sharper as the decade closes, because the public psychedelic movement grows more chaotic, while older ceremonial systems continue to demonstrate continuity and ethical structure. The broader esoteric significance of this period is that it reveals a familiar historical pattern. Visionary movements often peak in public and then retreat into a more isolated form after institutional pushback. The 1960s, therefore, are not simply a decline, they are a reconfiguration. The same ideas of revelation, unity, and liberation did not vanish, but they had to find new places to live. By 1969, the decade had reached its most ambivalent ending. The same year that consolidated psychedelic culture also brought growing doubt about its future and its public legitimacy. 1969 completed the arc that began in 1960. Research, mystical inquiry, public culture, counterculture, and prohibition all stood side by side in the historical record. That year did not create entheogenic meaning, but it fixed its modern form by forcing the culture to decide whether psychedelics were medicine, sacrament, art, danger, or all of these at once. The answer, as the decade shows, is that they were all of these depending on the setting and the community. Psychedelic practice remained compared to Tibetan Buddhism, Christian mysticism, Sufi ecstasy, and other esoteric frameworks because users and scholars kept recognizing similar descriptions of unity, transcendence, death and rebirth, and direct revelation. At the same time, the cultural aftermath of 1967 and 1968 made clear that public enthusiasm could not protect psychedelic work from legal and political attack. That tension is one reason the 1960s matter so much in the long history of entheogens. They revealed both the power of visionary experience and the fragility of the institutions that host it. In 1969, Philip K. Dick published U-Bick, a masterwork of reality-bending sci-fi that captured the paranoid, chemically altered, and shifting perceptual landscapes characteristic of the late 1960s psychedelic era. The biggest event in entheogenic and psychedelic history in 1969 was the Woodstock Music and Art Fair. Woodstock, held August 15th through 18th in 1969 in Bethel, New York, became the most famous late 1960s gathering of counterculture and psychedelic feeling. Nearly 500,000 people passed through the festival over 4 days, and the event quickly came to symbolize the era's ideal of peace, music, and communal freedom. Its lineup included many artists associated with the psychedelic atmosphere of the decade, including Carlos Santana, Janis Joplin, Jefferson Airplane, The Grateful Dead, Sly and the Family Stone, and Jimi Hendrix. Woodstock mattered not because it was a formal entheogenic ritual, but because it displayed the social world that psychedelics had helped create. A world of altered awareness, anti-war sentiment, free expression, and symbolic openness to new forms of life. The festival's drug use, especially marijuana and LSD, became part of its historical memory and reinforced the perception that the late 1960s had turned psychedelic experience into mass cultural language. That language had already begun developing in the Summer of Love in 1967, but Woodstock gave it an even larger public stage. In historical terms, this is the point where entheogenic culture is no longer confined to clinics, seminaries, or counterculture circles. It is visible to the entire world. The same year also carried increasing signs that the public and the state were turning against psychedelics, which made Woodstock feel like both a triumph and a last burning taper before restriction deepened. The event therefore belongs in the entheogenic chronology as a defining late 1960s culmination, rather than a side note. It crystallized a generation's dreams of peace, music, community, and consciousness expansion. This late decade turn is important because it shows how rapidly meaning can change around the same substances and symbols. The late 1960s reveal a growing enthusiasm surrounding entheogenic experience, But 1969 was not only about celebration. The same year that gave us Woodstock would also mark the hardening of public fear, which would soon reshape the future of psychedelic research and spirituality. By 1969, the psychedelic movement had become closely associated in public debate with disorder, rebellion, and loss of control, even as many participants still spoke the language of enlightenment and liberation. The result was a split historical memory. One side remembered revelation, the other remembered panic. Yet, both sides belonged to the record, and both were present in the final years of the decade. That tension helps explain why the 1960s remained so important in the history of entheogens. They made it impossible to ignore that a substance could be framed as sacrament, medicine, danger, or art, depending on the community and the setting. The older religious and esoteric spiritual systems remain the deeper frame behind this debate because the psychedelic vocabulary of unity, transcendence, death and rebirth, as well as revelation, continued to echo classical mystical systems. Even in the midst of public spectacle, scholars and practitioners were still comparing these experiences to Buddhist, Christian, and comparative religion models. That is what gives the decade its lasting significance. It did not merely popularize drugs, it reopened a question about sacred consciousness in modern life. Woodstock is important here because it shows the social surface of that question, while Harvard, Pahnke, Huxley, Osmond, Smith, and Leary show its intellectual and spiritual depth. However, darker psychedelic history was also unfolding. Charles Manson used LSD and pseudo-spiritual manipulation to control the Manson family, subverting 1960s counterculture ideals into a vehicle for absolute domination. Manson regularly supplied his followers with large amounts of LSD, while often abstaining or taking smaller doses himself, allowing him to remain the ultimate authority figure during their altered states. He used the disorienting effects of the drug to convince acolytes that their old lives, beliefs, and societal conditioning were meaningless, replacing their ethical frameworks with his distorted worldview. Manson mixed traditional Christian theology, apocalyptic race war theories, and sci-fi mysticism into his acid-fueled lectures, presenting himself as an omniscient guru. Rather than treating psychedelics as tools for genuine entheogenic liberation, Manson weaponized them alongside isolation, sleep deprivation, and apocalyptic scripture to dissolve his followers' individual identities and moral boundaries. By the end of 1969, the story had become bigger than any single event. It had become a decade-long negotiation over whether altered states could be treated as revelation or risk. Legal restrictions on psychedelics in the 1960s shifted from loose regulation to total criminalization, driven by state bans in 1966, tighter pharmaceutical rules, and the final federal classification of LSD as a Schedule I substance. New York became the first state to criminalize the non-medical use of LSD in 1965, and several other states followed, including California and Nevada, prohibiting psychedelics starting in 1966. Following the Kefauver-Harris drug amendments of 1962, the FDA required drug makers to prove effectiveness, not just safety, tightening clinical trial rules for experimental pharmaceuticals. Following tighter rules on clinical trials in 1963, the manufacturer Sandoz stopped supplying LSD for research in 1965. And the FDA increased enforcement on illegal distribution. In 1966, the National Institute of Mental Health stopped funding most clinical psychedelic studies, winding down official research channels. The United States Congress passed Public Law 90-639, or the Drug Abuse Control Amendments extension, making the unauthorized possession of hallucinogens a federal misdemeanor or crime by 1968. In terms of chronology, the decade ends with a record of increasing restriction, but also with a durable archive of books, experiments, essays, ceremonies, and songs that preserve the spiritual meaning of the era. Those works would help shape how the 1970s thought about consciousness, law, religion, and hidden knowledge. The 1960s therefore close not as a full stop, but as a transformation. What began in 1960 as Harvard experimentation ends in 1969 as a world-shaping debate over the nature of sacred experience. In our next video, join us as we move into the 1970s. The decade in entheogenic history was defined by strict legal prohibition, underground persistence, and academic redefinition. Following the passage of the 1970 Controlled Substances Act, which criminalized major psychedelics, mainstream scientific research largely halted, forcing spiritual and chemical exploration into private networks. Simultaneously, scholars and ethnobotanists sought to separate sacred plant use from recreational abuse, culminating in the coining of the term entheogen in 1978 to honor the historic and divine nature of these sacraments. Join us next time as we move from the entheogenic evidence found throughout the 1960s to the entheogenic evidence found throughout the following decade in the 1970s. Where will our expansive exploration of entheogenic or psychedelic plants found throughout global spiritual history take us after the so-called groovy 70s? Like and subscribe to find out. Thank you for watching. Find more at joinseek.org.